Before we get started, I want to review a couple of housekeeping items. First of all of your lines are muted, so please use either the chat or question feature on your control panel to ask questions throughout the presentation. The presentation today will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. So again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You will also notice at the top of your control panel on the left-hand side, there's a button with double arrows. You can click that button to collapse your control panel, and we actually encourage you to do so during the presentation so you can see that. We are recording this event today, and a link of the recording will be made available afterwards. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Solutions IQ.
Thank you, Leanne. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Agile 101 Basic Measurements. We here at Solutions IQ would like to thank version 1 for the opportunity to talk with you today. We'll be looking at some of the fundamental Scrum process metrics and the role they play in improving your software delivery. Our speakers are Dhaval Panchal, a certified Scrum trainer and Agile process coach, and Halim Dunsky, Solutions IQ's Director of Delivery Excellence. Dhaval's focus is on empowering people's creativity and problem solving by coaching them in Agile techniques. He has helped a wide range of companies in their Agile adoption efforts and has consistently seen how Agile enables companies to deliver value reliably and quickly in the face of changing requirements and business needs. In his spare time, Dhaval demonstrates his commitment to teamwork by playing minor league soccer, although a recent knee injury has left him with some extra time to devote to blogging about Agile software development and coaching. You can check out his blog at dhavalpanchal.gettingagile.com. We are fortunate to have Dhaval with us today to talk about using the sprint, burndown, and feature burnup metrics for early detection and resolution of development challenges on Agile projects. Dhaval, say hi, everyone.
Hi. Thanks for joining.
As Solutions IQ's Director of Delivery Excellence, Halim brings together top-level talent to collaborate on delivering customer value, whether that value is working software, technical training, or Agile process coaching. He values the power of Agile to enhance individual creativity in creating team success. Speaking of creativity, when he's not managing software consultants and Agile coaches, Halim plays guitar and hand drums and will publish a book of poetry later this year. That's some product backlog. Today, Halim will be talking to us about velocity, what it is, how it's measured, and how we can use what it tells us for planning and for process improvement.
Good morning.
But first, burn down, burn up. Dhaval, tell us about your favorite Agile metrics.
Thank you, Mickey. As we go along through this presentation, the first section of our presentation is about the introduction of metrics and measurements and what role they play within an Agile environment. Later, I'm going to talk about the burn down chart and the sprint burn up, and then I'll hand up my controls to Halim to inform us about the velocity and its use within the Agile teams. Well, as a coach, my experience comes from helping teams who are beginning to start doing Agile, and through that experience I've come to value measurements and metrics as indicators, a way to understand that there is something going on within our teams. They don't actually provide the complete information. They only give us an indication of what could be going on. What is really necessary for us to work with Agile teams is to actually go and speak with our team members. And that's our point of view. And if you were to take away something from this presentation, I will urge you to understand that metrics and measurements do not provide all the information that you need. They only provide an indication of where you can help your teams get better at delivering software. The Agile methods are defined by the Agile Manifesto values. All the Agile techniques such as XP, Scrum, feature-driven development, Crystal, they all uphold the Agile values which are defined in the Agile Manifesto. And if you look at the manifesto, there is no mention of the word measurements or metrics. Why might that be? Well, before we tackle that question, let's look at the world of measurements. Robert D. Austin, in his book, Managing and Measuring Performance for Organizations, categorizes measurement types into motivational measurements, informational type measurements, informational type measurements further categorized into process refinement type measurements. These are measurements that help you define your process and make incremental improvements within your processes and to manage to those experiments and see what really works for you. And coordination type measurements. These are logistical services in the sense that these measurement types help you coordinate your activities so that you can do and be more effective at doing and working on what you're doing. So the key thing about these measurement types is that nothing about a piece of information makes it inherently motivational or informational. Rather, it's the way in which the information is used that determines the measurement category. And within the Agile world, the use of metrics and measurements is for informational purposes. It's not intended to provide bonuses or to even provide negative incentives to individuals and people. A true use of measurement within the Agile environment would be to make process refinements and to improve the effectiveness of coordination between the team members. And I say that because Agile measurements need to acknowledge that knowledge work cannot be measured as managed as parts within a mechanistic system. Unlike a factory floor where you have a bunch of robots doing the same task over and over again, we cannot look at a dashboard and understand how our software delivery is progressing. We actually have to go and interact with the people who are trying to build the software. It is a creative process. So for us to understand the world of measurements within the Agile context is to acknowledge that in an adaptive environment, measurements and metrics do not provide all the information. And how do I come to this conclusion? Let's look at a couple of Agile principles. The first one is build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. What that applies is that the team and the people who are working on a software delivery project are intrinsically motivated to do the best that they can at any given point in time. And in this context, it's the responsibility for all team members, even your Scrum Masters, product owners, and the rest of the organization to build and maintain an environment of trust. Working software is the primary measure of progress. This is one of the principles which I personally like very much. What it tells me is that if your software is not working for your end users, then you have not demonstrated progress. All other measurements and metrics are surrogate or indirect measurements that do not provide an accurate picture of what's going on. They only act as indicators of what is going into your software delivery process. Let me talk about the Scrum Framework, because as we go along through this webinar, we are going to use the Scrum Framework as our point of reference. Within Scrum, the product vision drives the product backlog. A product backlog is a stacked, ranked, prioritized list of requirements or features that are expected to be built upon within a fixed time period, which is called as a time box or a sprint. A sprint is typically 2 weeks to 1 month in duration. And at the end of a sprint, a team takes these product backlog items and converts them into potentially shippable product increment. A potentially shippable product increment is technically competent enough so as to be shipped into the end user's environment so that the end users can use it for their benefit. Over multiple sprints, as the teams take on more and more product backlog items, you build upon your potentially shippable product increment to a point where a product owner decides, let's ship it. Now, how do you get started within your Scrum? Well, you have your sprint planning meeting. In the sprint planning meeting, the team takes the highest priority product backlog items, breaks them down into smaller tasks, and create what is called as a sprint backlog. The sprint backlog is owned and executed by the team, and every single day of the sprint, all the team members get together to hold what is called as a daily Scrum meeting. This is the first coordination point within your sprint framework. In this, all of the team members are updating to the rest of the team, what did I do yesterday, what I'm trying to do today, and are there any impediments. So use of measurements and metrics for coordination use find their place in the daily Scrum meeting or right after the daily Scrum meeting. At the end of your sprint, the team conducts a sprint review. This is where the incremental delivery of features and software is being reviewed by the team along with the product owner and other stakeholders to get feedback onto the product increment that has been developed so far. The team also performs a sprint retrospective where the team looks back at the process that they had applied in order to build their software product and use the refinements that they discovered through the retrospective to implement and to improve the software delivery process for the next sprint. So the use of measurements in your sprint retrospective takes the notion of a process refinement. In summary, Agile measurements are intended to provide transparency. They are intended to improve the effectiveness of the team in the way they coordinate their daily activities, and in the way they make changes into their software process delivery. It enables continuous improvement. So let's, with that background, look at the next metric, which is the Burndown metric. The only purpose that a Burndown serves for a team is it lets the team know, will the team meet its sprint goal? If your Burndown is able to provide you reliable information to track their progress against the sprint goal, then I would say that you have a good sprint Burndown. And it always keeps track of effort remaining. And that's the key, because in sprints, our focus is on the result as opposed to what we have done so far. So if you have to focus on the result, you have to understand how much effort is remaining for us to spend, and do we have the capacity to do that? And our Burndown allows us to keep track of these things. A few glossary terms. A product backlog item is what belongs into your product backlog. It represents a feature or a requirement that the team is trying to implement within a sprint. In your sprint planning meeting, a team entirely breaks down a product backlog item into smaller tasks. This is something that they can manage. These tasks are further estimated into hours. And it is these hours that go into your Burndown chart. Let's see how you can start your Burndown chart. On the x-axis, plot the number of days into your sprint. On the y-axis, plot the total number of hours that are remaining into your sprint. At the start of your sprint planning, add up all the task hours that you have created so far and make a point. From that point up until to the last day into your sprint, you draw a trend line, which is called as the ideal trend line. It's called the ideal trend line because if the team was to burn down equally every single day of the sprint, then that's the line they would track. Well, that's not how it happens anytime. So what you want to do is to keep track of the effort remaining on every day. So on day one, the team looks at all the tasks that they have worked upon and re-estimates the amount of effort remaining on some of those tasks. In this process, they may add new tasks to the sprint backlog. They may find that some of the tasks that they thought were relevant in the sprint planning are no longer necessary. During a sprint, there is this emergence of work that happens. And through that emergence, you capture the amount of effort that is remaining on every day. In this case, on the second day, the team discovered that they had less amount of work remaining than the day one, and so on and so forth, allowing them to track how far away are they from achieving their goal. It's always the amount of effort that is remaining. So how would you use a sprint burndown for coordination purposes? During a sprint daily scrum, the team gets together and updates all the team members on what they are working upon. This is what I did yesterday. These are the things I'm planning to do today, and these are my impediments. When impediments get raised by team members, other team members chip in to help out and remove those impediments. The key is to take the right set of tasks and to optimize your task selection such that you are burning down towards achieving your goal. Well, using a cone of plus or minus 20% allows you to see and measure whether you are actually tracking towards meeting your goal. So as you move along through your daily scrum, it's the team's responsibility to look at all the tasks that are remaining to be done and to look at the best and the optimized way of selecting these tasks so that the sprint burndown stays reasonably well within the plus or minus 20%. Well, there could be a case when the burndown is actually burning down very fast. In this example, on day 4, the team realized that they are actually going below the minus 20%. And at that point, they did not take in new stories. They actually went for 2 more days making sure that all the sprint tasks that they had accepted during their sprint planning were actually near completion. And only at that point they decided to pull in new stories to be worked upon into the sprint. And I think that is the key, because when you start working into your sprint, there is always going to be an emergence of work. And if you acknowledge that there is going to be an emergence of work, just because our burn down went below the minus 20% does not mean that it will stay below the minus 20%. So you have to make sure that as a team, because we have the responsibility to commit and deliver on our commitments, we make sure we meet our commitments first and only then select new stories to be pulled into your sprint. If this happens over and over again in all of your sprints, where the team is always pulling in new stories and getting all of that done, I recommend that you actually take on more work into the sprint. Because the idea is not to look good in front of our product owners or the management by pulling in new stories all the time. The idea is to provide predictability to our business to understand what's the true capacity of a team. And that allows your business to plan for new features and even predict dates in future. Halim will walk us through the use of velocity and how that helps us. But for now, all I'll suggest is if you go below the minus 20%, wait until you actually meet your original commitment, see if you can pull in new stories, and if this happens over and over again, try to increase your commitment over multiple sprints. Well, what happens if your burn-up is actually going up? Well, in this case, the team on day one realized that the amount of tasks that they had planned for in the sprint planning session exploded. So they decided when it's the right time to decide. They came back and they said, let's take a look at our burn down on day 4, and until that point, we will actually try to resolve some of the impediments, look at some ways as to how we can speed up our delivery process and reduce the amount of tasks remaining. On day 4, they got back together, and they found that if they could remove a few impediments, they would be able to burn down a few more tasks and would not have to work around these impediments anymore. They also talked to their product owner, and they dropped some of the features so that it could actually achieve something of value by the end of the sprint. Now, in this process, you could also look for external resources or external people who will help you during your sprint. As a worst-case scenario, you can choose to abnormally terminate your sprint. For process tuning use, I highly recommend that you use your burn-down chart and bring it back into your sprint retrospective. Looking back at your sprint burn-down and all the impediments that you had recorded during the days into your sprint and comparing both of them together will provide you insights into what was happening into your sprint. I'd like to share an example of a team that used to begin the sprint on a Monday, and they would go all the way for 2 weeks and end the sprint on Monday. Every time on Tuesday and Wednesday, their burn-down chart would actually spike, and then they would have a major dip. When they looked at all the impediments that they had captured over this period, they realized that some of the operations team, who this team is dependent upon, have a production release every Tuesday night. What that meant was this team was never getting any assistance from the production support team on Tuesdays. That was a revealing fact. So in order to work upon that, they started doing the sprint planning after the retrospective on Tuesdays because they knew that they won't get the necessary support that they need from the organization. And they could spend that time well into planning for the next sprint. Will that remove the marked jump and dip into their flow for the sprint burn down? For process tuning use, I highly recommend you keep track of the impediments that you have encountered during the sprint, and also keep track of your historical burn down charts and bring it back into your retrospective to reflect upon what is going on. A few pitfalls that I would encourage you not to do is first, do not hide your burn down charts. Your burn down charts are intended to provide the team with the information at all times. So make it big and visible into a team area where they can readily look at that and they don't have to struggle to get to the information which is critical for them to understand how they are implementing onto the sprint. It also acts as a good radiator of information for other people who are interested into the sprint outcome. What that allows for stakeholders and other people is to look at a big burn down chart while they are walking past your team area and understand how you're progressing towards your sprint goal. It would help you tremendously to reduce all the reporting overheads that probably you may be facing in your organization just by making it big and visible into your team areas. Update your remaining task hours daily. Too often, many teams, when they get started with their sprint burn down initially, they forget to update the task hours. And there could be many reasons for that. As a Scrum Master, I encourage you to talk to your team and figure out a way where it is easy for your team members to update task hours daily. Because if you don't have the current information about the amount of hours that are remaining into your sprint or the effort that is remaining into your sprint, then that prevents you from making correct decisions and making early course corrections into your sprint. Finally, this is a common signature that I've also seen with teams that are cross-functional in the composition, but they are not cross-functional in behavior. What I mean by that is, although the team has all the cross-functional skill set, for example, it has analysts, it has developers, it has QA people, it has other domain experts, but when they don't share the amount of work that they are doing, there is no role sharing between the team members. Too often, everyone focuses on just a task that they are comfortable with. So your burn down looks very nice up until the last day of the sprint, where a whole host of tasks that no one wanted to do are abandoned. So I would watch out for a signature like this and talk to the team during the retrospective and see how you can change that behavior. In summary, a sprint burn down allows you to know, can we meet the sprint goal? It always represents the effort that is remaining to be spent into your sprint. It encourages early course correction. Now, we're going to talk about the sprint burn-up. Well, a sprint burn-up, unlike the sprint burn-down, tells us will the team deliver on the stories that they have committed to within a sprint. And delivering a story means that it's an incremental delivery of working software, and it includes done. Let's look at a few glossary terms because I've used a few terms here which I think I need to elaborate on. Well, first of all, a user story is a way to represent your product backlog item. A user story typically follows a format where you have as a user role, this is someone of the end user group that is going to use your system. I want a feature, this is what they expect from the system, so that they can achieve a given value. A user story always represents a vertical slice of functionality that has some business value. Into your sprint planning session, a product owner typically explains the product backlog item in the form of a user story to the team. The team goes through a planning poker exercise to relatively estimate product backlog items with other product backlog items. A relative estimate is to look at one story and say, this is probably a small. And then look at a new story and say, the amount of effort that we're going to spend on the new story as compared to the one that we just called as a small is probably a medium. And it's relatively sizing on the amount of effort that you would typically spend on getting this user story from a concept to the completion state. To learn more about relative estimation and planning poker technique, I highly recommend the Agile Estimating and Planning book by Mike Cohen. At the end of your sprint planning session, all of your user stories are estimated in story points. A story point is a relative measure. It's a unitless estimate of the amount of effort that the team is going to spend in order to develop the story into working software. Done means that it is built the right way and it is the right thing to build. To build it the right way, it has to have all the deliverables associated with taking your functionality that just works on my machine to a production environment where it can be used by your end users. And in that whole effort, you will have to create more deliverables, more than just coding. This typically include testing that piece of functionality, doing some performance testing, making sure that it follows the architectural standards, ensuring that all the infrastructure that is necessary for this feature to work on a production environment is set up. You may have to go through an analysis documentation or some design documentation in order to understand how this feature is quality compliant. That's the technical competency, right? How you assert the technical competency of this feature. Well, is this feature actually doing what our users expect it to do? And that's captured in your acceptance criteria. An acceptance criteria tells you what information the user is seeking and what behavior the user is seeking from this feature. When you have a feature that meets the user's expectation in terms of functionality and it is technically feasible, let me take that back, and it is technically of the quality where it can be reliably used by your end users. That's when it's done. So how do you start up with your burn-up? Initially, at the end of your sprint planning, on the x-axis, again, capture the number of days that are remaining into your sprint. On the y-axis, capture the total number of story points that you have committed within your sprint. Mark a point. And on an ongoing basis, as you move along with your sprint. For example, in this case, on day 1 and day 2, the team did not have any feature or user story that was done. Again, done meaning it meets the definition of done and it meets the user's expectation regarding the behavior of this functionality. So at the end of day 2, they had about 8 points of user stories that were accepted by the product owner, and it was done from a technical standpoint. As the sprint progressed, they started capturing the cumulative total of all the story points that were accepted by the product owner during the sprint, and by the end of the sprint, this team had all the stories that they had committed to accepted. Well, how would you use it for coordination purposes? The thing about user stories and completing them within the sprint, and I need to talk about this concept. Let's take a look at 2 examples. The first one, I call it as a Scrumafall or a mini waterfall or water scrum. There are many names for that. In this, when the team begins under the sprint, they start working on all the design aspects for the features that they have committed. Then they start working on coding once they are completed with design and they're satisfied. Once they finish all the coding aspects, they move on to unit testing. And by now, the sprint is near end. So you have to either do very little of functional testing or defer it for a later sprint. Now in this case, none of the features or stories are done. They don't meet the technical requirements of actually getting a feature completed. So there is no value that is delivered at the end of the sprint. Now if you were to approach this from an incremental standpoint and take a vertical slice of functionality as represented in your user story, get that completed. By that, I mean that user story is designed, code, unit tested, functional tested, and accepted by your product owner. Move on to the next one, and then to the next one. Now, even if you are unable to do the 4th story that you committed to into your sprint, you still have 3 user stories that are completed into your sprint, and your sprint now has some value that is being delivered to your end users. Now, if you were to focus your entire team to actually work in this way, that would bring up some new coordination and cross-functional behaviors. Now, if you were to take all of these stories, the biggest benefit that you're going to get is that you will reduce the amount of work in progress. A work in progress means that you have many stories that are being designed at the same time or being coded at the same time, often leading at the end of the sprint for a major handoff to a QA person or to someone who is downstream to take all the work and convert that. Now, to focus on every single feature functionality and get it done discourages these late handoffs into your sprint, and it actually allows your team members to figure out new ways of working together and to have more of a parallel approach of developing features within your sprint. It also allows for early feature feedback. It allows your non-technical users who probably don't understand the design patterns that you're using or the DAO access layer and how it integrated with Hibernate. That may be cool for us developers, but for our non-technical users, we have to provide something that they can touch and feel and give you feedback upon. And that feedback is critical for you to get your product backlog ready for the next sprint. By providing this ability for your non-technical users to look at the features early on gives you enough time to actually start refining your product backlog items or user stories for the next sprint. I would like to talk about the example of a team, and this team was beginning with their sprint or beginning to use Scrum, and this was the very first sprint. It was a cross-functional team with about 5 developers and 1 QA person. At the end of the sprint, they did not have any story that was delivered by the end of the sprint. We went into the retrospective, and this QA person was literally pulling his hair out. I don't like Scrum at all. Earlier, when we used to do waterfall, I used to have about 2 months to finish all the testing that I had to do. And now, I get all these features on the very last day to test, and I cannot do that. Well, we looked at that and we said, how can we help you to test all of these features on a daily basis? So first of all, we had to help him write down these test cases in a format where any one of the team members could actually decipher it. You know, because he was the only person who was writing these test cases and executing them, most of it was cryptic code language that only he understood. So now we had to work collaboratively with this tester, and the rest of the team chipped in under the leadership of this QA person to start writing manual test cases which were already codified, but to make it in a way that anyone within the team could execute on that. Over a few sprints, by the time they were done with the third sprint, they were able to reduce just 2 weeks of QA effort that only one person could do to an effort where the entire team would chip in every morning for 2 hours and do a complete test pass on the features that they have developed. And that included both regression testing and new functionality testing that they had to do. Just by providing that focus on business value delivery on every single day of your sprint, you can encourage and allow for cross-functional behavior to emerge within your teams. Some pitfalls to avoid. In favor of the sprint burn-up chart, please do not abandon your sprint burn-down chart. A burn-down chart provides one dimension of how the team is progressing towards the sprint goal, and the sprint burn-up chart provides you a dimension of how value is being accrued during your sprint. And both of those dimensions are critical to understand how you're progressing towards the end of your sprint. Do not wait until the last day of sprint to seek acceptance on stories. My recommendation is that the team should have at least one user story that is ready for product owner acceptance by the middle of the sprint. It allows for the product owner and the team to gain a common understanding of the vision of the product and to have early feedback mechanisms between the product owner and the team to make sure that we truly understand what is expected from this product. If you wait until the last day, it's typically a lot of stories they're not done, and they have to push into the next sprint, which is not a good thing because now you have taken away the business's ability to prioritize for the next sprint. You're now forced into taking the same stories that you worked upon in sprint 1 into your next sprint, namely sprint 2. In summary, a burn-up chart allows for early and continuous feedback. It allows you to focus on delivering business value, and it helps you drive cross-functional behavior. With that, I would like to hand over the mic to Halim, who will talk to us about velocity.
Thanks, Dhaval. Velocity can be simply and naturally understood as the rate that the team can attain, as the capacity of the team. It's something that we measured sprint by sprint, and it's based on results delivered, not effort expended. This gives us a good basis for planning because track record is the best basis for estimating what's going to happen next. How do we do it? To begin with, the team is responsible for creating the estimates for the items in the product backlog. This is very important because the estimate represents the team's best assessment of what they themselves are capable of, and it's built based on their own knowledge of their relative strengths and weaknesses and the domain that they're working in and so forth. The team at the beginning of the sprint pulls items from the product backlog in priority order into the sprint backlog and then does the work. And at the end of the sprint, the story points for the stories that are completed and accepted are counted, and that very simply gives you the sprint velocity. We have two examples on the screen here. At sprint 1, the team committed to 20 points. Actually, 16 points were accepted, so 16 is the velocity. And in the second example, that team committed to 24 points and got acceptance on 24 points, giving a velocity of 24. Now, velocity is a very sensitive indicator of a number of things that are going on with the team. It will fluctuate or shift based on changes in the team membership. If people are being added or removed from the team, people take vacations and so forth, this will obviously affect the team's capacity. The nature of the expertise that the team can bring to bear in terms of the domain of the system that they're working with, the technologies that they're working with. The collaboration skills also very important because, of course, software is delivered by a team, not by individuals. What's the nature of the environment that the team is operating within? If the team is getting interfered with by forces outside of the sprint backlog, this is going to show up in the velocity. And of course, if there are impediments that are not relieved with appropriate process, you'll see the results in a decrease in velocity. Now, we use velocity for coordination purposes in planning. This is one of the most significant benefits of having a good handle on this measurement. Just in the same way that the burn down and burn up give you an idea of what to expect within a single sprint, velocity gives you an idea of what to expect over the course of time. It's built over the historical measurements of the team's actual software delivery sprint by sprint, and this gives you the ability to forecast with stakeholders what the likely rate of achievement is going to be over the longer course of time. This lets everybody in sales and marketing and finance and operations and so forth, as well as people doing work on other software development teams, understand what to expect and to plan for the correct coordination of dependencies. Let's take a closer look at this. Actually, I'm going to go back for a second. What you see in that picture is a set of story cards ranged along a wall. They've been put in priority order by a group of team members and stakeholders. And with those priorities established, it's possible to count forward along a virtual timeline and get a sense of where the team is going to be at any given point. And of course, if there are multiple teams each doing this, then you can see what the relative coordination points are going to be in time and make plans to have the dependencies met as you need them. When we look at these as a stack ranking of stories, we see this pile of stories, and each of them has its own estimate in story points. You count down through the stack in terms of the rate of velocity, and you'll see what the likely contents are of each sprint and where you can expect to get to at the planned deadline. Now, of course, velocity will vary, as we've said, and so when you're doing an exercise like this, you can forecast achievement based on the long-term average. You can look at the most recent velocity and perhaps take a worst-case estimate based on the slowest velocity. So you'll see in this example here, the current velocity of the team is hovering near the low end and is somewhat below the long-term average. You can use your judgment about which measurement to believe and manage your risk based on the spread between the best and the worst cases. In the simplest terms, if you take the number of points in the backlog and divide by the velocity, that will give you the number of sprints that it's going to take to accomplish that result. 300-point backlog and a team operating at an average velocity of 20 tells you that it's going to be about 15 sprints to complete the work. Now, if you don't like that answer, you have a number of things to do with the lead time that release planning gives you. You can think about adjusting the release date. You can adjust the planned scope for the release, or possibly adjust the resources that are devoted to the work. Let's talk a little bit about the way velocity can be used to help you guide the process of improving the way the teams are functioning. We've indicated that a solid team typically will achieve a stable velocity over time within a range of perhaps plus and minus 20%. And in fact, you'll see when you start a new team, the velocity will grow and then level off to a stable rate. If you find that the fluctuations are greater than 20%, you may want to look to stabilize the team or the environment that it's operating in. If the team is getting interfered with by management, dropping extra work onto the team, contravening the agreements about the sanctity of the backlog, this can cause problems if people are being pulled off to do other work, and even if you have vacations and so forth. This is something that you learn by having a conversation with the team. You see the pattern of fluctuation in the historical velocity. This doesn't tell you what the problem is, but it tells you where to look and begin a conversation to get the additional data that you need. Similarly, if you see the velocity trending sharply down or up, this may well be a factor of the way the team is approaching technical debt. Technical debt, of course, is the accumulation of difficulty based on the team not meeting the desired quality standards. Let's take a closer look at that. Here's a case where we've got velocity measurements for a particular team over the course of 9 sprints. They started work and velocity was rising over the first 4 sprints, And you might say, well, this is terrific. The team is learning to work together, and they're understanding the domain, getting a grip on the technology. Of course, the velocity will improve. Maybe that is the explanation, and you find out by talking to the team. Let's look a little further into the history. Sprint 5, all of a sudden, the velocity came crashing down to about half its original rate. What was going on? Well, it turns out that this team, under their feeling of pressure from management, decided to skimp on unit tests, and they were writing quick and dirty code just so that they could declare completion. By the time they got to Sprint 5, though, they were having to build the next bits of the system on top of that soggy foundation, and it got very slow. At the retrospective, at the end of Sprint 5, they were able to recognize the situation and decide that it was time to bite the bullet, go back and refactor that code, build up the test coverage, and so you see in Sprint 6 and 7, they accomplished relatively little in terms of user story points because most of their effort was going into correcting the work from before. Then by the time you got into Sprint 8, they were beginning to work on a cleaner foundation, and the velocity increased and eventually stabilized around 10 or 11 points. So this is one example of the shape of a curve that indicates the history of the team, and I really want to emphasize that the history that you see in the velocity diagram is indicative, and it calls you to have the conversation, just the way a story card calls you to have a conversation about the details of the user feature. There's some things that velocity will not do for you. One of the important points to understand is that velocity is a relative measurement. It only applies within an individual team. You can't compare or add or infer the relative performance by comparing the velocities of different teams. Each team's own sizings are idiosyncratic. They refer to what the capacity of that particular group of people is, and this is why you can't compare them from one team to another. You can compare for a single team over time, but not across teams. Velocity does not imply commitment, although we expect in general that the team will make a commitment in the next sprint for a velocity that is similar to what they had in the previous sprint. There are all kinds of legitimate reasons why this can vary, and it's the team's responsibility to commit at the beginning of each sprint. Finally, it's important to emphasize we do not use work that is not done in velocity calculations. The story has to be both technically complete and accepted by the user in order to count as part of velocity. But there are a couple of good reasons for this. One of them, as I'm sure you'll all know from your own experience, the first 80% of the work on a story can take the first 80% of the time, and the last 20% can end up taking the second 80% of the time. Because of that unpredictability, we think it's much more effective simply to not count partially completed work. The other reason is that it helps focus the team on the use of delivered value as the real metric of achievement. If the story isn't complete and accepted, it's not potentially shippable. The effective value delivered is not yet anything more than 0. And that's why we do it that way. So now to summarize, we've been through 3 foundational measurements. Burndown tracks the amount of effort remaining, either in a sprint, as we saw, or you can look at this on a release level. Burn up tracks the amount of software completed and delivered, and velocity tracks the history of the rate of delivery of software. And we believe that if you master the use of these 3 basic metrics, you'll be well on your way to a good foundation for your Agile practices. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mickey.
Thanks, Dhaval and Halim. That was great. The key to success with Agile is doing the fundamentals right and then using inspect and adapt to improve your process. Today, we've seen an important aspect of that with these metrics that can be used to feed back into that. We're going to take questions in a minute, so go ahead and send us our questions if you have more besides ones we've gotten already. But first, let me tell you a little about Solutions IQ. We are a company that offers a full spectrum of services to develop software and fulfill technical talent needs while improving our clients' Agile knowledge and capabilities. Our clients include Fortune 500 companies like AT&T, Chevron, and Microsoft, as well as growth companies like Classmates.com and InfoSpace. We work together with Version 1 to equip companies with the tools and knowledge that companies need to succeed with Agile. We work with companies at every stage of Agile adoption, offering everything from introductory and certification training to full enterprise-level management consulting services. Solutions IQ's nationally and internationally recognized Agile expertise grew out of our own use of Scrum and XP development practices in our professional services division, doing outsourced software development in Java and .NET, and providing embedded development teams to our customers to help them meet their immediate business needs. We're not just talking ivory tower theory. These are hard-won lessons that we learned while delivering customer value in the form of working software. The Solutions IQ difference is that we will help you improve your own engineering practices while still delivering quality software. If you're just getting started with Agile, we offer individual training and certification. If you're beginning to work with Agile teams, we provide hands-on coaching and workshops and embedded Agile teams for co-development. And if you're ready to implement Agile company-wide, we provide a comprehensive enterprise Agile adoption program. On a recent enterprise Agile adoption contract, we observed that one of the big constraints on team velocity was the cost of system integration and deployment. The customer was channeling all of their product releases through a configuration management team, who therefore became the bottleneck for every improvement. And this impediment was visible in the velocity of every team. We sent a continuous integration, single-click deployment consultant to resolve the impediment, and within 2 weeks, one sprint, one of their teams was deploying via a fully automated build and integration process, and others were well on their way to that goal. With that impediment resolved, their velocity was free to increase. We also provide Agile product owner training to help our customers refine their requirements and use Agile more effectively to improve their return on investment. Whether you're a developer encouraging grassroots XP adoption or an executive trying to build your agility company-wide, Solutions IQ has the tools, the training, and the skilled professionals to help you succeed. We've received a lot of questions, and we'll get to as many as possible, but we're not going to have time to answer them all. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with a complete answer via email. Halim, when you're calculating the velocity of a team, do you count the points from bug fix stories?
Let's be a little bit more specific about bug fix stories. If you're talking about fixing bugs that come up in the course of doing the work on the stories that are already in the backlog for the current sprint, you don't take extra story point credit for that work. You may need to allow task hours for that, and that should be reflected in the burndown. If you're talking about bugs that get dropped onto the team from outside the agreed backlog during the course of the sprint, this is really a disruptive practice that we don't recommend, and if you have the need to devote regular attention to bug fixing, we recommend separate resources be dedicated to that activity. On the other hand, if you're talking about bug fix stories that are scheduled into the sprint from the beginning, then their points belong in the backlog just like any other story points, and they're counted just like any other stories.
Dhaval, you were talking about how to structure the work within a sprint. We have a question here about whether you should have separate test and development iterations or just put them all together.
I would say there are no separate test and development iterations. It's all happening all at once within a sprint. So you're taking a concept or a requirement from your product owner in your sprint planning session, develop enough understanding to actually go ahead into your sprint, do the analysis that is required to do the work, do some amount of design, code, test, and by testing I mean all the required testing aspects that you have to cover, unit testing, functional testing, and if necessary, even your performance and load testing that you have to do. And by the end of the sprint, you need to have a feature or functionality that is ready and potentially shippable. Now, when I say that, I realize that for many teams who start off initially, this is going to be a challenge. So take a look at what you can actually accomplish within a sprint. Call that your definition of done for a sprint, and aggressively work towards removing all the impediments that prevent you from building a potentially shippable increment within a sprint.
Thank you. Halim, we have a question here about the change in velocity over time. It says, shouldn't we expect velocity to increase in later sprints as the team picks up ideas and retrospective feedback loop kicks in?
Absolutely. We look for continuous improvement, and one of the obvious places that that shows itself is in an improvement in velocity. Generally, what we see is that a new team or a well-formed team that's working in a new area will show a gradual improvement until a level at which they level off in velocity. Now, at that point, it's possible to sit down with the team and try to come up with some creative ideas for taking it through to the next level.
Dhaval, how do you motivate your team to update the burn down and burn up metrics? I understand they're important, but how do you get them to actually put the time in for that?
The first place I would look for is it easy for the team to actually update the burn down chart? Because if it is not, and it takes a lot of labor and it takes a lot of pain to go through whatever you have to go through in order to update a burn down chart, your team may not do it. You also want to look at educating your team members and making them understand the importance of the burn down chart. The importance of a burn down chart, again, is to know whether you're going to meet your sprint goal. And if a team persistently does not update their burn down chart, as a Scrum Master or a stakeholder or even the organization that has invested into the sprint, you have every right to ask, can you meet the sprint goal? And ask them to prove it to you. A burn down chart is the simplest way to demonstrate whether you're on track to completing your sprint goal or not.
If you're working with an automated tool, such as provided by version 1, for example, you may find that it's fairly easy to get this work done. The tool will even produce charts for you, and then if you want, you can take a monitor that's dedicated to displaying that chart and have it be visible all the time in the team area, or you may even choose to transfer the information to a bigger chart that you can hang on the wall. This becomes a source of motivation for the team. Everybody on the team can see it. Everybody who walks by the team area can see it, and it becomes a basis for bragging rights. The team, if it's functioning in a healthy environment, will be very happy to show how well they're doing, and they'll be very willing to be transparent about when there are problems.
Thank you, Halim. Thank you for adding on the big visible chat aspect. Thank you.
Information radiator is very important.
Yes.
We've got a couple of questions relating to accuracy of team member reporting. You were talking, Halim, about how team members will enjoy seeing their progress being radiated, but we have questions about, do team members tend to underreport the work remaining to try to make the team or themselves look better?
I would emphasize that if that is happening, and that can happen with measurements and metrics, because if the intended use of the measurement is to act as a positive or a negative incentive for motivational purposes, if I feel penalized for reporting the right and the true information, it's most likely the team members will not report the right information. So you have to build an environment of trust in that case and look at how you can actually use it for the intended purposes of coordination and process refinement. Could you repeat that question? I just want to make sure I'm...
Do team members tend to underreport the work remaining so as to create the illusion of progress if they're stuck?
No, they should not. Some team members may do that, but that will show up at the end of the sprint where you would not meet your sprint goal or not deliver on the stories that you have committed to. We've also looked at the example which Halim shared with us, where a team actually underreported or misrepresented the progress, where the velocity increased dramatically to the point where the system was unstable to build any new features going forward. So you may not see the effects of that right on the first sprint, but I can guarantee in the next couple of sprints it will begin to show up.
Thank you. Halim, as a manager, I want to make sure all individuals are efficient. How can I measure individual velocity?
Velocity, as we use it in Scrum, is not an individual measurement. Software is delivered by teams, not by individuals, and so it's simply not meaningful to speak about the velocity of an individual.
Dhaval.
Yes.
What do you think about taking several sprints at the beginning of a project to flesh out the target architecture without actually delivering any working code to the customer?
I strongly do not recommend that. Every single sprint, you have to have something that is of value, and to spend all of that time in figuring out an architecture may not be the right thing to do. I think for the purposes of this discussion, I'll just stop at that. I'll just say I highly do not recommend it, and every single sprint you want to stabilize your architecture while moving forward.
Well, that's all the time we have today, unfortunately, for questions. Be sure to tune in for our upcoming webinars on executive-level Agile metrics and strategies for maximizing Agile portfolio value. And thank you for attending today's webinar. We'll be emailing all of you attendees with links to a recording of this presentation and copies of the slides to pass on to your colleagues. For more information on our Agile development and consulting services, you can check us out online at www.solutionsiq.com or schedule a call with one of our consultants by sending us an email at info@solutionsiq.com or calling us at 1-800-235-4091. Thank you again for attending and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.